Okay, so thank you everybody that's joining us this morning. Today we have Marie Law Adams, who's a founding partner with Dan Adams for Landing Studio, which is a firm based in Boston. Landing Studio is an architecture and urban design practice focused on improving infrastructural environments and the urban public realm. Landing Studio has been recognized with National AIA Honor Awards, a Progressive Architecture Award, an American Planning Association Gold Achievement Award, participated in the Design Biennale Boston, and received the Architectural League Prize. They also participated in the Seoul Biennale in 2019, where they showed some of the works. I'm not sure if we'll be seeing today, but as you can see, they've received multiple awards and recognition, as well as exhibitions internationally. So the work has been exhibited in institutions such as MIT, RISD, Parsons, and the City College of New York. Marie's a registered architect and a lecturer of urban design in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, which for you is 8 p.m. So I appreciate the time. This is somewhat of a, I don't want to say casual, but it's a conversational or open lecture where everybody's invited. But the floor is yours in terms of how you want to guide it. If you want to get questions from the audience while you're talking, or if you want to leave it to the end, also just let us know. And we're hoping to get some sort of conversation going at the end where we can kind of pick your brains or thoughts on issues of infrastructures.
Mm-hmm. That sounds great.
Yeah.
I'm happy to, thank you, thanks. I'm happy to take questions at any time, but I'll warn you that I'm probably just going to plow through. So if you want to stop me, just say something and I will be more than happy to address questions or comments. So I'm going to share my screen and, okay. And I just want to make sure if, can you see the slide advancing?
Yep.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so thank you so much, Raphael, for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be sharing the work of Landing Studio with Hanyang University this morning with you all. The title of the lecture is Making PALs. And PALs is an acronym, stands for Public Access Landscapes. And it's a word that we started to use a few years ago at Landing Studio to describe the kind of work that we do. And we look at it as a way of transforming public spaces that are not public to be more public. And we understand that that sounds like something of a contradiction, public, but not public. And that's because we're referring to a kind of challenge of scale, a specific kind of the spaces of industry and infrastructure that really cater to a specific scale of public, the regional, through supporting the flows of goods and materials and people. So that could be highway networks, industrial districts, working waterfronts, and so on. And the kind of real challenge with these places is that they are designed for the scale of the regional public to the detriment of local communities and local ecosystems. The kind of problems of these types of spaces are well known and well documented. They rupture urban fabrics physically. They create harmful environmental impacts, and the United States has had a long and violent policy of using highways in racist ways, industrial districts, and in issues of environmental racism, and so there's all of that. So in our work, we try to look for ways to improve these spaces. They're very challenging. We look for ways to try to develop the publicness of the space, to create infrastructure and industrial districts that are more plural, that do more for more people, and do a better job of negotiating the scales between the regional and the local. And we also think that it's important to provide alternatives to a kind of either or mentality that really has developed around spaces, especially of industry, which kind of contribute to a false choice in development processes between things like jobs and open space, for example, when looking at questions about working waterfronts or industrial districts. Our argument is that through design, you can do both. So we use PALs as a way of kind of speaking about the work, because a lot of the projects that we do end up sort of looking and feeling a lot like parks, but they're not parks, and that's, you know, kind of important to put out there, because in all of the cases, we're still maintaining the infrastructural or industrial function of these landscapes. So tonight, or today, this morning, I'll be talking about our projects in two ways. One is through tactics, which are sort of shorter scale, more temporary ways of increasing the publicness of a industrial or infrastructural landscape. And sometimes these tactics make their way into projects. And the projects are kind of the more durable and long-lasting designs for industrial and infrastructural landscapes to be more public and more plural. And those projects, when we get into that scale, we start to get into considerations of operations, the sort of condition of being active and how that is part of the design. And then also policy, or at the scale of the project, we call it micro policy, that the design itself goes beyond the physical plans to and really gets into questions about agreements or protocols for certain types of actions or uses that increase the public good of these types of spaces. And then politics, in dealing with how decisions are made, and especially how groups come to agreements about the futures of spaces like these, especially in the sense that, you know, a lot of the design interventions that I'll share are pretty simple and straightforward, but achieving the political will to implement those changes is often the biggest challenge that we face in our work. So a lot of the work is really looking at how to set the stage for implementation to happen, how to kind of guide the process to get there. So I'm going to start with a little bit of context. This is an area that I'll kind of continue to return to in this lecture. This is Chelsea Creek, which is one of the tributaries of Boston Harbor. You can see the kind of early colonial settlement of downtown Boston in the kind of lower center of the map. And this is a navigation map from the late 18th century. And so just zooming in a little bit, I guess what I wanted to note with this is the way that the water and the land are drawn with the kind of dot pattern, the stippling, which is a kind of representation that allows for a sense of kind of ambiguity and fluctuation between in the boundary between land and water. This was a tidal marshland. The creek was sometimes really broad and wide, and then other times very narrow at low tide. And so the dots kind of suggest that fluctuation that happens on the daily cycle. And then we kind of fast forward to today, and the Chelsea Creek is actually still represented with a series of dots, just like a lot less dots. These are GPS coordinates that are also used for navigation, but what they're doing is outlining the profile or the kind of footprint of a piece of large scale infrastructure. This is a federal navigation channel, which has been designed to support global scale ships to arrive in Boston Harbor and to bring goods like petroleum and road salt and produce products to the regional community. So an example of a regional or even global scale infrastructure. And you can kind of see that traced out through Boston Harbor in this image here. So we're looking at Chelsea Creek, and then the navigation channel extends all the way out into the Atlantic Ocean here. And it's remarkable because this is an entirely invisible infrastructure. It's one that has received generations of investment. You know, millions upon millions of US dollars have been invested in deepening the channel as the ships got larger and larger with each generation of industrial development. Yet a lot of, you know, it's very hard, it's impossible to see. It's only known through navigational maps. And so those types of infrastructural investments are always tied to decisions around land use. And so this kind of infrastructural relationship results in Chelsea's waterfront looking something like this, where you can see the entire shoreline of the Chelsea River being dotted with oil drums and wharves and, you know, a high density of industrial activities. And you can also see how close all of this is to residential neighborhoods. And so this is what Chelsea Creek looked like in the 1950s. And then jumping back again to more contemporary times, this still has an imprint in the way that Chelsea is today. So it's the most dense industrially zoned municipality in the state of Massachusetts. It has about 35,000 residents and a very large number of immigrants from Central America. It is the second most dense residential municipality and the smallest as well at 2.2 square miles. It's quite tiny. But you can see in the image here, all the kind of black figure is the industrial landscape, characterized by wide expanses of asphalt, warehouse buildings, and you can also see how it entirely runs the edge of the Chelsea waterfront to this day. And sort of reflecting that either or attitude that I was talking about a couple of minutes ago, we found this quote in the local paper years ago that said, "I have a feeling I'll find out soon what Chelsea will stand for the next 100 years. Will it be residential or industrial? I hope you choose wisely. I already have one bag packed." So this mentality that, you know, that it could only be one thing, that kind of the public good was really incompatible with industrial activities. And this is actually really reinforced through policy decisions at every level. So we see in Chelsea in particular, a conflict between local zoning, which actually excludes all industrial activities from the waterfront, whereas the state only allows for marine dependent industries on the waterfront. So the two of them completely contradict each other, creating a condition where the waterfront is undevelopable. And federal homeland security adds another layer of impenetrability to the waterfront on top of that, which I'll go into a little bit later. But what that results in is a waterfront resource that looks like this. It provides nothing for the local community. It's kept in a holding pattern of airport overflow car parking, rental car parking lots, because it's these uses are sort of a loophole to get around this zoning conflict between the state and the municipality. And so this of course is not doing anything for the public. It's not a heavy industrial use, but it's also separating the community from the waterfront. And so then to kind of narrow in on a facility that we've been working with for several years in Chelsea, you see in the background the two really large piles of road salt. So that's road salt that's used for de-icing in the wintertime in Massachusetts. The state uses about 1 million tons of road salt every year for de-icing, and it goes across the entire state to local municipalities. And in the foreground, you can see a Panamax ship passing through a drawbridge. These ships are 900 feet long, the size of more than 3 city blocks in Chelsea, which is a very kind of old city for the United States. So it's something that completely dwarfs the scale of development around it. Here's the ship again passing through the drawbridge, being tugged into the berth at the salt terminal. And then this is just showing the process of unloading the ship. Cranes take the salt out of the salt holds in the ship and then drop them onto the dock there. And it creates a really extraordinary landscape, something it's sort of a moving mountain of minerals, which you can kind of see here. It's a very fluid thing that sort of changes with the weather. With every storm, it either rises and falls. And so this salt is then stored, the salt is then put into trucks that go out and spread onto the streets during winter storms. And if you kind of step outside of the road salt terminal and take a look at this dock from the neighborhood, this is the view that you would see. So it's a little bit hard to see, but downtown Boston is in the background. You can kind of see the skyline of some of the towers back there. And this is a picture when all of the salt has been taken out by truck from the facility after a winter storm. And if you have a self-unloading ship bring in more salt within the course of 12 hours, there could be an entirely new horizon of Mexican salt, which is a white color like this, directly evaporated from the ocean. And then the next day it could be Chilean salt, again, completely like changing the urban landscape and view towards the water. And then Northern Irish salt, which is mined underground and is full of minerals that give it a really dark brown color. So this is something when my partner Dan and I first started to work in Chelsea, we realized that this kind of industrial operation was something that really heavily shaped the community's relationship with their waterfront. It had a big impact on the way that people live in their public realm. But there really wasn't any dialogue between the industrial uses and then the local residents. So this led us to one of the first kind of tactics that I'll talk about, which is project on. So we were graduate students. We were trying to find a way at the time to kind of initiate a dialogue between the industries in Chelsea and the local residents. There were a lot of tensions, as you could kind of tell from that newspaper clipping. And so we were really inspired by the work of Jenny Holzer, who does a lot of projection work, projecting, poetry or phrases. And this piece in particular, where she was projecting words onto the shore in Rio de Janeiro that would sort of appear with the crest of a wave and then disappear as the wave dissipated. And we saw the salt landscape is actually something that did this at a slower scale. It would, rise with a ship's delivery and then disappear after a storm. And so could we capture some of this dynamic kinetic landscape with projection in a similar way? And so we started to test projecting with really simple theater lights onto the pile. It at that time happened to be the first time ever when the Red Sox local baseball team went to the World Series. And so we were urged by the salt terminal to theme the projections on the sports teams, which we did. And then there was a presidential election. So we projected the words vote on the salt pile. And we kept doing this over the course of a couple of years, different messages. This one saying, let it snow. They were meant to be funny and really kind of accessible, not something that would really be something that anybody could engage with. And then you see here the kind of to spring. So we had this projection that was March on to spring, which got, disappeared after a late snowstorm. So kind of just demonstrating that kinetic nature of the salt pile. And it was successful in the sense that it did start to initiate a dialogue. These are clippings from local papers and the Boston Globe, viewing the piles in a different light. There were journalists who talked about how, as a sort of co-benefit of these projections, this dark industrial corridor was illuminated at night and it felt safer and so on. But there were also skeptics. We really liked this cartoon, and it was one of a few that were created around the time, which still kind of get at this this kind of tension between the industrial activities and the interests of the local community, talking about, you know, what are the environmental impacts of having such large scale industrial activities around here. And so then I'll shift it into another kind of smaller scale tactic that we've been working with, which is to invite people in. This is a picture of what a lot of Chelsea's waterfront looks like. It's a 6 foot tall concrete wall. Just on the left-hand side of this image is the waterfront. It's a waterfront community, and many people there don't know that they, or haven't known that they live so close to the waterfront because they can never actually physically inhabit it. And this is in some cases due to Homeland Security measures, which regulate who can enter into industrial facilities. The images of a credential that's required typically to be able to enter into any facility that's taking global shipments. And so when we started working with the salt terminal, we really felt like it was a failure in design that the entire industrial terminal, this 10-acre space, was treated as a security zone where the activities that were of concern to the Homeland Security regulators were really what was coming on and off of the ship, which is a very small aspect of what they do there. And so we worked to try to really target, well, what's the real security concern? And we're able to reduce the security perimeter, which would have been a 6 foot tall fence around the entire facility, to something that was about 1/25 the size of it, which opens up almost about 10 acres of new space on the waterfront that anybody could walk into. There are still gates and fences, but it creates the possibility that the public can occupy this waterfront. And so these are the drawings that we use to kind of negotiate with Homeland Security to do that. And this is the design intervention here in this case. It's incredibly modest. It's a shed with a window in it that allows a security officer to view the gangway that leads to the ship, and that's it. All they need to do is to be able to monitor who's coming on and off of the ship. And that then opens up the entire facility to be used for different things. It makes the facility, the dock itself, available for public uses. So these were a high school senior dance that took place on a harbor ferry one year, a teacher appreciation cruise another year. The local Boys and Girls Club can come and make visits and see ships that are docked at the waterfront. So all of a sudden kind of opening up this space for something that the public can take advantage of when they live in such close proximity to it. And this works in a different way too. So this is an image of another terminal that we work with in New York City on Staten Island. And these types of road salt terminals in the wintertime are extremely active because of the winter de-icing function. And so it'll look like this through, October through March, a lot of activity. And then in May and through the summertime, it becomes really dormant and quiet, and the salt pile is smaller. It's tarped over, which you can see with the red, white, and blue in the background. And a lot of the landscape is actually opened up because a dock, a marine terminal, really is in some ways just a big laid out space. It's just a kind of flat paved landscape that's used to kind of temporarily store materials. So one of our early projects that became kind of an ongoing event that we worked with Staten Island Arts, which is an arts organization in Staten Island, was to design the Lumen Film and Performance Art Festival. So sort of take advantage of this opportunity of time or the seasonality of the industry to introduce new uses to activate the space in the summer months. And so this is a permitting drawing that is showing different configurations of salt piles and art installations that happen at this one night event that we had done for multiple years. And so one of the first things that we do is it's a half-mile long facility. So it's a really, really large space. It's quite dark at night. It's not designed for for, you know, typical kind of urban activities as a kind of working waterfront. And so we try to kind of highlight the space with light and create a way of going through it through cues with lighting, illuminating all of the different industrial buildings and artifacts like the crane that you see here, the smoke tower here, and so on. And sometimes the artists themselves will kind of begin to incorporate their work with the industrial equipment themselves. So this is a front-end loader being used for a projection. We work with the salt terminal relationships to bring in shipping containers that serve as kind of smaller scale galleries and more kind of intimate spaces for screenings. And then even the kind of industrial equipment itself, when illuminated, starts to become things that people interact with. They take their pictures with them, they kind of climb on them. It's an opportunity to get close to things that, you know, a lot of people don't get to in their everyday life. And we had been doing this event for a couple of years, and then all of a sudden we did it one summer when there hadn't been very much snow at all. And actually there was still quite a bit of salt that was left on the dock in the summertime. And so that kind of caused us to change the approach, where it was more than just kind of creating an infrastructure of new lighting to invite people in and allow for this installation of art installation work. And actually to start to use the salt as a material for the art installations. So we designed a kind of series of these small salt piles that create a kind of spatial framework for art installations. We were able to use Mexican salt at the time, again, because it's very soft and fluffy because it's evaporated right from the ocean. It's not a rock crystal, but actually a very like loose salt crystal. So it feels good to the touch and is also a good kind of projection surface because it's a really pure white. And so we designed these kind of gardens of salt, this kind of S shape salt pile here. We worked with the labor force of the salt terminal to lay these shapes out on the ground. They used little hand piles of salt to kind of mark the areas. And then they built them with the equipment that they use in their kind of day-to-day industrial activities. And then the artists themselves started to work with the machine operators to create some very site-specific works that incorporated the salt. So you see an artist here kind of directing one of or a couple of the salt dock workers to kind of sculpt a pile. Here we have an artist who kind of used the pile as a pedestal for a performance. In this case, it's used more as a kind of gallery and performance space to kind of create an enclosure in an otherwise really large dock. And then some artists also incorporated the salt as a material within their work. This is the one that we were seeing where the artist was working with the dock operators. And again, another example of incorporating the material, projection surface. And by the end of the night, the piles themselves kind of get beat up and as people kind of climb on them and use them for viewing the works from different vantages, it's a very kind of friendly material to climb on, and then kids kind of come in and make their own sort of installations in the space. And then the next tactic I'll talk about is bringing things out. And this is just sort of a fun project that we did a couple of years ago. We were invited by the Architectural League of New York to design the environment for their Beaux-Arts Ball, which is a one night party event in New York City where all of the kind of local architects gather. And every year it's in a different location. And so the installation is a 4-hour, it lives for 4 hours essentially. It's a very short-term fast installation. And the theme this year was called Vector, which was about flows of materials and information and people. And so our work kind of fits into this category because a lot of the work we do is with logistics and kind of that sort of thing. So this was the building that we were given as a site. And it was really just characterized by a 300 plus foot long hallway. And you can see the kind of beams on the top of the columns there. That's a gantry system that used to be used to unload rail cars. And this was the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So this used to be a more industrial building, is now used for other things. And then this is what we looked at in the installation. So we were kind of inspired to, you know, use the industrial materials that we use in the work with the salt terminal, specifically the tarps that are used to cover the salt in the summer months. So you see here some seamstresses that come from all over the country every summer to stitch by hand with handheld sewing machines, the tarps that cover the salt when it's not being used. So we worked with the salt company to special order tarps in the red and white colors that they often use. We were able to specially order fire retardant tarps because these same materials are used for covering coal piles as well as salt. And we had to order them 1/2 the size that they typically would use them because of, you know, one of the biggest kind of hurdles for us in doing this installation was the kind of sheer weight of the fabric itself. They were 300 pounds each when rolled into a bundle like this, into a roll. And so we used the little large scale models in our office to both try to understand like what were the shapes and forms that could be used with these tarps if they were brought into this kind of really long hallway space, but also to actually just physically figure out the logistics of getting them in and moving them around without the aid of industrial equipment that is typically used in the process of tarping a pile. And so we came up with a strategy of how to unroll the tarp down the hallway and unfold it and lift it piece by piece and attach it to this gantry system to kind of create a new context. So you see the kind of installation process here. Some of our team kind of like trying to hoist the material up, and a view of that there. So we had this kind of hanging detail that connected the tarps to the beam of the gantry. And then the design really became about developing a vocabulary of different ways of hanging the material that responded both to some of the constraints of the space in terms of life safety systems, all of the alarm strobes and annunciators and egress doors had to remain functional and visible. But then also we had to do things like create a DJ table, a DJ booth, and a table for the bartender and those sorts of things. And so that created these different types of moves, like drooping the tarps and lifting them up into bundles and dressing tables, leaving rolls out that could be used as a seating surface that you see in the foreground of this image here. And so this is what it looked like during the event when it was just like filled with people. One of the passageways, bartender early in the night. And we really liked the red and white in the sense that it could really take different qualities of light and create a whole kind of glow in the space. And these tarps were then just returned to the salt facility in Staten Island. So this was right after the event. And then later that spring were used to tarp the salt pile. So we saw the installation as just an intervention in a material flow that was already happening. When the new tarps were being ordered, we simply kind of took them out, used them for a party, and then brought them back to their kind of longer term home here. And so now I'm going to switch over and talk about a couple of projects. So this is one called the Port at Rock Chapel Marine, and this is the facility in Chelsea. And this is just looking at a kind of longer term project that we've developed there. And you can see on the left-hand side, it's a salt terminal, and then on the right is an oil terminal. So this is what it looks like from the street level. And the kind of project that we were approached with at this time was to help the salt company design the expansion of their operations into this oil terminal here. And as I mentioned earlier, the waterfront in Chelsea is undevelopable in the sense that there is no legal way or that to develop it without a special agreement with the city. And that's kind of reflected in the zoning code here. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what is a way to create a more both and strategy that could allow for the local municipality to get what they want, which is waterfront access and a space for the community, and then allow for the state to get what they want here, which is to preserve jobs and a regional industrial economy. And so we started to look at this Venn diagram of the two kind of conflicting interests and thinking about ways we can bring them together. And we developed the kind of concept of the port, which is this publicly organized recreation territory, or otherwise known as a privately operated resource territory, kind of speaking to the dual notion of the landscape strategy. And it sort of takes advantage of the tactics that I was mentioning with the Lumen Film Festival, and in the sense that, you know, this is a calendar of what the salt looks like, or the salt dock looks like over the course of the year. And you can see in the months of May, June, July, and August, there's a kind of big space in there. And we were looking for a way to take advantage of that space in the design of the port. So basically the proposal became, can we create a facility that is a salt dock in the winter months, and then in the summertime becomes a public recreation and event space. So it's sort of dual use here. And so the design intervention in a sense is actually very, very simple for this part of the project. It's simply striping a paved landscape to be able to suggest the different types of uses that it takes on in the summer months. And it in May, basically the agreement is that the salt company moves all of their salt off of this basketball court and track and event space, and moves a fence back. The court is restriped and repainted every summertime, and then used by the public. And this is a picture of it the first summer that it was opened. It sort of met a big demand for basketball. And, you know, as the kids are playing out there, there are ships passing by. They're right on the waterfront with the breeze from the river and everything. So it's a really interesting place to kind of bring that kind of recreational activity. And this was done through, you know, the design itself is very simple. It was done through the design of a policy more than of a physical space. So we worked with the city to develop a agreement that this new basketball court space would be recreated every year, so that they have a long-term contract that says, well, if you're going to redevelop this as an industrial terminal, we want to continue to get the public recreation amenities every summertime. And so it's kind of made concrete by this agreement here. And in addition to that, we also worked to design how the salt industrial activities work so that they are better for the local neighborhood. So on the left, you can see a series of different salt piling strategies that are used to kind of prioritize views from the local streets to the waterfront, so that rather than getting that Northern Irish wall of salt in front of you, we look for ways to kind of keep those view corridors clear and allow for people's views of the waterfront to be maintained. And then there were also other kind of longer term tactics that were used to develop more year-round recreational access to the waterfront. And so those took advantage of like a really close reading of what the kind of physical architecture of the dock facility was. And again, this is a lot of hidden infrastructure. A lot of industrial or waterfront sites are this way, but we found that there were two major utility lines running underneath the dock. And those areas couldn't be used for stockpiling salt because that would make that could potentially damage the utilities. So those became great locations to introduce parks or public access to the waterfront. And then the nature of the water's edge as well was something that we looked at, where there was a more gradual slope to the waterfront. It was kind of more safe for public use, whereas the kind of steep steel bulkhead is much better for berthing a barge. So we started to kind of rezone the space in a much kind of more variable way between recreational uses and industrial uses based on some of that analysis. And we ended up having to develop almost a dual drawing set where we needed to demonstrate to the state regulators that all of the industrial functions could still be performed in these spaces, that we weren't taking away the industrial capacity that was protected by this state law. And then at the same time, but that we were also supporting those things in a way that could be utilized by the public. So integrating things like ship bollards in the middle of planters that were used as the public access space to the waterfront. And those two things are compatible uses. They don't really affect one another. In some ways, it's just sort of designing the negative spaces of the park to be able to support industrial activities. And so the oil terminal was demolished starting in 2013. We did a series of lighting installations at that time as well. This kind of projecting on tactic to announce and kind of initiate a dialogue again with the neighborhood that this space that had been kind of separated from them and a barrier to the waterfront for generations was finally going away, and that this space was going to be opened up for public use. And so as the oil tanks themselves started to go down, we projected the word goodbye on the tanks, which disappeared as the tanks went down. And then we went to start to really look at all of this material of the oil terminal, and came up with a demolition strategy that also reused a lot of the elements for the public park. So this is one of the roofs coming off of the oil tanks, and then the panels getting removed from the dike. This is my partner marking the line for what would become an amphitheater that was contained inside of an old oil tank dike. And then that's a picture of it during construction, and then more recently here. So, kind of trying to utilize these industrial artifacts to create a sort of memory of the place and a kind of character to it that we probably wouldn't have been able to do otherwise if we were just designing this park space from scratch. So introducing, geodesic domes below the kind of industrial domes for kids to climb on. These were foam cannons that were used to extinguish fires in the oil terminal, which are now used as spray fountains for kids. For water. And this was a truck loading rack that is used as a stage for theater performances. And we find that, these types of projects are really made possible by working with the industrial operations. And in this case, we worked with the labor force of the salt terminal to actually build the park. This works quite well for them in the sense that, again, the seasonality, their workers are really busy in the wintertime with the shipments of salt, but not as busy in the summertime. And so then they can take on other types of projects like building and maintaining this public access landscape. So this is a plan of it that was part of our kind of regular drawing set for the project. But because we were acting in the role of the general contractor for the project ourselves, we actually worked entirely through construction sketches to build the project, basically by creating sketches of what to do that day, handing them to the dock workers and talking out on site, like how to build the space. And it was created that way. And so this is a view of that landscape more recently now as the plants have kind of grown in there. And something that has come through this practice of working with the employees of the facility has kind of opened up the opportunity for new types of events and activities there too. So this is Theater in the Park that happens every summer that we help kind of, you know, mediate between the performers and director of the plays with the salt dock workers to come up with stage sets that are made out of salt in some cases. So this is a performance of Hamlet doing his soliloquy on a miniature salt pile. We worked with the dock employees to come up with a grave for Ophelia in this production that's digging into the salt pile. So you see that being performed here. And then the next summer, Midsummer's Night's Dream was using, an artist kind of created this stage set scaffold that used salt as one of the materials. So I'm going to jump over to another project, which is I-93 Infraspace. This is a under highway landscape. And this is what the site looked like when we began working on it. It was, you know, very kind of out of sight, out of mind in the city of Boston. It's downtown. This is what the highway looks like from above. And you can see that on the right-hand side, there's new development that's happening right up next to it. This is what the highway looks like at the street level. It had been used for years by the state's Department of Transportation, which owns the infrastructure, as a construction laydown space. It had become, you know, very unkempt. There were crimes that were happening under there. And the local community really started to put pressure on the state to do something about this, to kind of make the space better. And it was, again, a real rupture in the urban fabric and had a lot of impacts on the local waterway, where you can see the proximity to it right there. So when we started working on this project, you know, we had to be creative to find a way that a state transportation agency, who was the kind of client for the project, could make something that is, by all other names, a park, essentially. So the State Transportation Agency supports mass transit and highways, air flight, and also pedestrian and bicycle mobility. And you can see that in their logo here on the right hand side. That kind of became the entry point for us to be able to create a kind of essentially a park landscape underneath this overpass, as a way to kind of create connectivity and bring in new uses. And so our concept with the project was really to kind of multiply this particular side of the transportation agency, to bring in as much infrastructure to support pedestrian and bicycle transportation as possible. And so we did this by introducing a new shared use pathway that kind of connects through the landscape, which you can kind of see through here is this kind of main circulation spine. And that's an image of it there, kind of entering into the site. The water is on the right-hand side. And then we had another type of transportation infrastructure to support pedestrians, which was this more meandering boardwalk here, that was meant to kind of create different types of viewing relationships through the ramp structures, be able to kind of elevate you into the canopy of trees, and to be able to get kind of a different sense of the space through here. And then the other kind of part of the project was stormwater management. So the transportation agency, like part of the type of work that they can fund is anything that supports their own infrastructure. And in this case, doing stormwater management and doing better stormwater management through landscape was a way of kind of bringing in a park, but by calling it infrastructure. So all of the stormwater drainage that used to just directly go into the harbor, we rerouted. So this is a diagram of all of the catchment areas that land on the highway above. typically it would just go into an underground network of pipes and then immediately drain into the harbor, bringing all of the pollutants with it off of the roadway, any kind of oil spills, sediments, and so on. So we look to divert all of that and bring it into landscape and stone systems. So to filter and treat the water before it gets into the harbor, but then also to use that treatment landscape as an amenity, as a kind of way of bringing green space into this highway landscape. And something that it also does is it kind of makes legible everything that's coming off of the highway and would otherwise go into the harbor becomes something that you see in the landscape here. So the pipes are visible. All of the kind of trash and debris is, is present and actually becomes something that you see in the park. And that's not a bad thing because this is now, it's not going into the ocean and it's actually in a place where it can be cleaned out and maintained as a part of the maintenance practice of the park. And then the other piece of this equation was maintenance of the infrastructure itself. So this is a concrete crack monitor that you're seeing in the picture here. So the whole highway structure for this area is cast concrete. And as part of the maintenance, the transportation agency needs to be able to do visual inspections of every square inch of the concrete and at a regular interval. And in order to do this, they need to be able to bring out boom lift trucks to do that. And so when we started the project, we started having some conversations with the transportation, the bridge engineers who do this inspection work. And they said that a real problem that they had was that the site had been just covered in gravel and sort of left undesigned, and their trucks would always get stuck, and so they wouldn't be able to perform their maintenance or their inspection efficiently. And so we started to design a series of what we called maintenance access plates that were distributed throughout the park space, which were essentially just flat paved areas that could then double function as recreation spaces. So they were sized, in this case, to be a basketball court. Another one was sized for a dog park because that was what the community wanted to be developed there. But then they could also support, at the time of inspections, the movement of this equipment into the space. And so they were all designed with that reach radius that you see in the image here above. And so this is a picture of the basketball court area actually getting used for other type of fitness. And again, this all got kind of reinforced through what we would kind of call a design policy for this project. Because the kind of project initiator was a transportation agency who can't maintain parks, who can't program parks, who can't bring activities into them, they needed a private partner to activate the space. And so this lease was written to require that the operator of the space puts on a certain number of art events throughout the course of the year. And a lot of really careful attention was paid to making sure that the space would be used for a lot of different kinds of activities to kind of bring people in rather than keep people out, which had been the policy of the transportation agency for years. And so that's really transformed the area into something that's more like a kind of outdoor mural gallery. The private operator continues to kind of add to it year after year. And I should say that the kind of financial equation of this is that the lease operator gets revenue from parking facilities that are designed as part of this project, where you have a kind of much more regular bridge structure, whereas this park space is really occurring where the highway ramp structure is very irregular and it didn't lend itself well to the parking use, which was originally what the transportation agency had wanted to do here. And then I think something that we really think is interesting in this case too is the kind of possibility with when working with such a large kind of bureaucratic agency is to kind of, work within their systems. And in this case, it's their specification system, because the State Transportation Agency builds the same, does a lot of construction and does a lot of the same type of construction over and over again. They kind of codify their specifications. And so as soon as you get a design approved into their specification system, it can be used on any project. And so in some ways, the real kind of hurdle in this process is that initial act of design. But once you've done it, it can be redeployed anywhere. So we were really kind of proud of the fact that we were able to get something called dinosaur lights included or incorporated into the state's specification book, which meant that these, this is just a different part of the site that we worked on, these lighting fixtures that were kind of meant to break down the scale of some of the pedestrian crossings underneath the highway and sort of serve as a kind of multifunctional lighting environment and scaffold for art installations, could be used not only in this space, but also in other under highway spaces throughout the state. And then I'm just gonna close with a project that, all of these are really kind of longer term projects that take multiple years to realize. This is a project that we started in 2017 called Charles Gate, and we're still working on. But just to kind of talk about some of the politics of design, I think this is a really significant and interesting site, which is the Emerald Necklace Park system in Boston is one of the most well-known park resources in the United States, and it was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, who sort of founded American landscape architecture. And this is one of his seminal works. The other is Central Park in terms of the renown of these projects. And the area we're working on in Boston is in that red rectangle there, which was the Beacon Street, which was originally designed as the Beacon Street entrance to the Emerald Necklace. And it's a really interesting and important point in the city, which is at the intersection of this Olmsted Park system, the Esplanade Park system in Boston, which is along the river here, and then the Commonwealth Avenue Mall, which is also a really another very well-known park system in the area. So the culmination of all of these things together. And when it was first designed, it was, a really kind of idyllic landscape, a series of these kind of pond-like basins, full of vegetation, Victorian new buildings, and so on. And then in the 1960s, it was a real victim of the highway era attitude of development. In the image on the right, you can see the construction of the Boker Overpass, which was a elevated roadway that was built right down the center of Charles Gate Park. And so it caused the channelization of the Muddy River, and it was actually paved at the time. And a lot was, the park completely changed. And so this is what it looks like today. The Muddy River is not a very healthy water system. If you see in the back of the image here, all of the drainage from the overpass directly drains right into the river, bringing all the pollutants into it. There's a lot of waste floating on it. Duckweed blooms, which is the green here, which is an indicator of an unhealthy river. And then this is what it looks like on land. It's very uninviting. There's no amenities or furniture or pathways or anything that really supports human experience or use of that space. And so we've developed a series of a kind of plan for the space with a local community and a parks conservancy in partnership with the state recreation group. And these are some of the images that we've developed of the design, just to kind of give you a sense of the space. So this is what it looks like today. Some of these really large granite walls were built at the time of the overpass. And so we're looking to bring those down and to open up the space, open it up for recreation and kind of naturalize the riverbank edge. Introduce again, like a stormwater management landscape, learning from the previous project that I was showing. So using the kind of landscape feature or treatment as a kind of park feature. And then another image here. And I'm not going to go into very much detail on this project, but I think what I wanted to close with on it is the kind of design politics. Again, this kind of question about getting all of the different parties involved in projects like this to agree on a way forward. And a lot of the challenges of infrastructural and industrial landscapes are really kind of exemplified in this image here, which is simply a drawing that we developed to sort of forensically trace all of the drainage infrastructure that ran underneath this park. And the reason we had to do that is, you know, this park, it's in the center of Boston, in between, you know, two really vibrant neighborhoods, yet no one ever uses it. Everybody who's, you know, thousands of people who go to Red Sox games pass through the area. The Boston Marathon goes right through the center of the landscape, yet there's no use in the park at all. It's really not something that serves the local community. And a big reason for that is it's kind of, it's owned by multiple state agencies. And that's what you see in this diagram here. Every single color is a different combination of jurisdictional agencies, both state and local. And every time they combine and create a new mixture is a new color. And so the water kind of really exemplifies this complicated pattern of ownership. And this drawing exercise here, and this is the design drawing here, and I'll read it to you. Basically, the takeaway is that the new stormwater design is trying to simplify all of the different combinations of ownership here. The state agencies all wanted separate stormwater management landscapes. So you can see in this drawing, there's only 3 colors, whereas there's 7 colors in this drawing. So there's much less different combinations. We've sort of untangled all of the different ownership issues. And they do this for accountability, for being able to monitor and understand what kinds of inputs they're putting into the river. But this drawing, I would say, took our office a total of 4 months to put together, between doing field work, coordinating with surveyors, trying to understand what was underground, what was no longer there, looking at historic drawings, and then working with the engineers of all the different state and local agencies to figure out like what their vision for the space was. We couldn't take forward any of the design work that we wanted to do and that the community wanted to see there in terms of bringing in public access until this kind of infrastructural piece was resolved with them. So I think these types of you know, and I think, I guess what I want to say about this is that the process of drawing, or being able to put such a kind of complex condition on a piece of paper for everyone to look at, was really the kind of key to unlock a kind of new way of thinking about this space that has been held in a real sort of holding pattern of, you know, not serving anybody very well for over 50 years since the construction of the overpass. So that's what I wanted to end with. I want to thank you again for having me here and letting me share my work and the work of Landing Studio. And I would be more than happy to kind of discuss anything or answer questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. That was great. So I actually enjoyed the temporality that you're showing in your work, that, you know, you're going back on the Chelsea project from 2000. When was the start?
2004. It's embarrassing.
No,
I thought about taking the dates off of those.
But I think that's the important part of these infrastructural projects, that there's a path dependency for building infrastructure, that once you make the decision of, okay, we're going to build this road, it'll last there for generations. And as the urban fabric grows around it, it ends up creating these weird urban voids. And repairing those urban voids also takes the same amount of time, right? So, and it could be an evolutionary process, yeah, that could take many decades, as you're showing, just because of all the different, you know, policymakers and all the people involved in that have their hands on all of these
Yeah.
properties, right? You're
Exactly.
showing the Chelsea one. I didn't know that it actually involved the state
Mhm.
legislation as much as just the Chelsea legislation, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. All of these projects take a lot of time. That's why, it's sort of a lifeline for us as designers to do shorter term projects in the interim. And I should say that our office does other kinds of work. We do buildings for these same clients too. And in a lot of ways, they're so much simpler and more straightforward than working in the infrastructure spaces. But uh, you can learn from the shorter term projects and kind of bring some of those lessons into the longer term ones, which I think has been really fruitful for us as a practice over the years.
but I think, well, what I like is the exposure that your projects give to the problem that these infrastructures
Mm-hmm.
are causing to the community or to the
Mm-hmm.
urban fabric, um, which starts as a well, I'll speak for the Chelsea one that it starts in this fun way of the art installation, but to make it obvious that this is something that's obstructive
Mm-hmm.
or that there's a hidden potential in
Mm-hmm.
all of these spaces that if from the beginning of the planning portion of the infrastructure or the city or I don't know where did it start, right? But at the beginning of the planning, if we think of these typologies as urban spaces rather than just engineered
Mm-hmm.
spaces, perhaps that could be a better take on
Absolutely.
future cities or something that we can learn for the future of how to continue development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And perhaps that's an impossibility asking that engineers and architects and policymakers and all of these things combined to think about the quality of space.
I think we're seeing some promise here in the kind of northeast of the United States with this, that there are some attempts at kind of revisiting what used to be single use space zoning strategies to coming up with more kind of mixed use industrial districts. They have new problems in the sense that there's industrial uses are really the kind of the lowest use from an economic standpoint traditionally. Like they don't always make a lot of money, and and whenever there is kind of any type of loophole that allows another type of development, housing for profit and that sort of thing, or hotels, then the industrial uses are really kind of vulnerable to that. So there's been some measures that are happening in Baltimore and New York and Boston starting to think about this too. But how do you kind of value the jobs that such facilities can bring in and the kind of diversity and the economic profile of an area, while also not repeating some of the kind of separation of use mistakes that were made in the past when industries were a lot more noxious than they are today. There's a lot more examples of kind of cleaner facilities that are much more compatible with urban activities than there used to be.
But do you think then that that's a problem of, let's say, the planning department of thinking still of 20th century or even early 20th century kind of conditions of, well, we need the zoning, and then
Yeah.
industry is industry in that sense that it's I don't know if it's still from the early 20th century of thinking of Ford Motors and
Right.
huge
Yeah.
chimney stacks and all these things. But
Mhm.
um, I would say that industry in the 21st century is actually more, um, it's more rewarding to have it in the city
Mhm.
rather than zone it out and kick it out of the city. And there are all these clean industries that are happening that allow for industry to exist within the urban fabric.
Yeah. Yeah.
But is there a possibility of changing that zoning regulation?
There is, and there has been some examples of that, and a lot of times, just because of the kind of the lack of competitiveness sometimes of industrial facilities, especially when and that's changing. I mean, it really depends on context. Like warehousing in Boston is becoming increasingly competitive with online shopping and those sorts of things, but like when you look at a context like New York City, it's really difficult for industrial uses to compete with almost any other type of land use.
Right.
And so the policy really has, kind of shifts where, in the turn of the century, all policy around industry was to kind of separate the noxious uses from residential areas. And now it's more to kind of create industrial sanctuaries or protected areas that support are kind of designated for industrial uses. And that's the kind of measure you see on the Chelsea waterfront. I think Boston and the state of Massachusetts was learning from some of the industrial business displacement that was happening around the country in the 1970s and 80s. And then the state took the measure to kind of require areas that had the marine infrastructure to be protected for that, which creates a ton of challenges for the communities that have those, like Chelsea, for sure. So the policy is definitely not without its problems and limited.
What's your take on density, the issue of density in moving these things? Because when you compare, well, right now you were talking about New York and Boston, and of course, New York is 10 times, right, the population of Boston, which means that real estate is going to become way more valuable, and anything that you do in that density has to be seen under a different scope. How do we maximize everything out of this piece of land in terms of profit, usability, everything? While perhaps the lower density in Boston doesn't allow to push that agenda.
Yeah, you see different patterns from that. New York there's been some examples where and I don't think, there's not a lot of built examples yet, but in Long Island City, for example, one of the facilities that Amazon was looking at when they had the proposal in Long Island City was a case where they were doing a cross-subsidization strategy where the city had worked with a developer to require that there was like an industrial, a certain square footage of industrial programming in the base of a high density residential development. And the market rate housing was supposed to offset the cost of supporting the industrial facilities. And WXY, the architecture and urban design firm, was involved with that, was the designer for that project. And I remember talking with them because I was doing a studio in that area a while back about some of the challenges of defining exactly what industrial activities are and what relevant ones are in Long Island City today. So is that breweries, is that bakeries, is that maker spaces? Like, what does that mean? And like, what are the types of jobs and that you're trying to protect, attract, preserve in the area? Boston has been starting and planning to look at some mixed use industrial facilities, or the idea of doing, ground floor industrial uses with offices above to potentially get at those at those issues of cross subsidy. But you're completely right. The density is much different. And so there's not necessarily the same equation. I'm not sure that the equation actually works out in New York either, because a lot of these projects are still kind of on the books and haven't yet been realized. But
and in terms of the PALs, which actually I like the term. Actually, in Seoul, there's a term for POPs, which is public spaces for. But in terms of the PALs, have you guys looked at then hybridizing other programs that are not necessarily about, let's say, public access, public grounds? Well, not as a, let's say, a landscape strategy, but like strictly some other architectural program, like actual building hybridity into that space. I mean, the Chelsea one, you were talking about the amphitheater, right, and all these other, how it could act as a community space, as a theater. But have you guys actually thought of hybridizing? I would say that still remains as a public ground program, and not as an architectural building. Let's just say building, as opposed to like, is there any? Have you guys looked at other types of programs that are not necessarily related to the PALs, but perhaps could hybridize in these spaces?
I mean, the one example that comes to mind, which is it's still kind of in the realm of the same project, but is we designed a headquarters building as part of the port at Rock Chapel Marine project that you're referring to. So this headquarters building is used as sort of like a warm space for the industrial workers between their shifts on the cranes and in the machines, and also as a place for doing the stevedoring, so watching the kind of berthing of the ship and maintaining the lines, and then also dispatching trucks to municipalities. And all of that program is something that we kind of packed into a really narrow building that is narrow in order to kind of have very close relationships to the activities that are happening on the site. And in the process of designing that building with the owner, we all kind of came to this realization, like, we're investing a lot to make a very small building here, especially on the waterfront. It has to have deep pile foundations. There's a ton of like unseen infrastructure to build this. It's a very expensive building. Like, why not put another level on it and use that as a kind of event space, something that can support other types of uses.
Mhm.
So they have the kind of second level of the building is just an open space that is used for larger gatherings, types of meetings that the kind of industrial user never was able to have, because they used to operate out of a series of small trailers. So only 5 or 6 people at a time could meet with each other. So this kind of creates a more communal space. And then it's also used by community groups, because Chelsea doesn't have a lot of kind of event space facilities. So that's maybe one example of trying to like hybridize what would otherwise be an industrial building for public use.
Yeah, I feel like there's like a chicken egg type of problem here, that if you build it, they will come type of thing. Like, can we put program and then that will attract people, but then you're not allowed to make a actual building. So you start with the strategy of the PALs, and hopefully the PALs will start changing the surrounding neighborhoods and densifying the surrounding neighborhoods, and then hopefully in the future then that will change the zoning and allow for more program to come.
It does, yeah.
But yeah, it feels like there's like a real chicken and egg type of situation. Like, which one do we densify, or which one do we inject? Do you see any other type of infrastructural spaces that are not transportation related, or well, right now you've shown industrial spaces or the infrastructural spaces. Are there any other type of spaces that you guys are studying that also form these type of urban voids?
We're working on another project that's it's probably very similar to the salt terminal in a sense, but it's a couple of them. One is a public works facility that happens to be located on a riverfront. And so it has some similarities with the salt dock in the sense that a lot of what a public works facility does is the movement of materials. It's sort of like a logistics center for getting waste in and out of the city, and gathering like construction materials and that sort of thing. And so we're working on that project to kind of make their operations more efficient, such that we can carve out a public park space along the riverfront. And so it uses a lot of the lessons that we have taken from the project in Chelsea in terms of thinking through how to be efficient about truck routing, how to create safe spaces for trucks that are in proximity to pedestrian traffic and that sort of thing. And we're working on another, this is a very new project, but another warehouse facility, again, on a waterfront, and trying to design a kind of ring of public access, like a nature and education trail along the edge of it. And a lot of the similar issues about stormwater management. How do you use stormwater management as a kind of feature of the public space? And then also dealing with the kind of different kinds of traffic in those conflicts.
And are there investigations on new forms of infrastructure, like smart infrastructure for activating, let's say the I-93 underpass spaces? Can you use some type of new smart infrastructure technologies to use the space in a, let's say like a shared, like time share type of thing, right? So with apps, you could have different programs happening at different times. People could sign up to use the space at different times, or events or things like that. Is there any move towards using applications or something that allows for events to occur? Or
we haven't seen that yet in our work. I think that's a a great opportunity to think about. But so far, the difference, the space in Chelsea is managed. The public space is actually managed by the city. It is featured on their website as one of their parks, even though we legally cannot call it a park. And they do all of the kind of oversight of reserving the space for events and that sort of thing. And then the one in Boston has a kind of private ownership, and that there's a lot of issues that come with that in terms of or private operator that I mentioned. A lot of issues that kind of come with that in terms of what kinds of events and like who events are designed for and that sort of thing. But it's these are some of the kind of practicalities that have to get figured out with this kind of project.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Are there any are there any questions from the participants as well? I tend to monopolize the dialogue, but if there's anybody that's interested in asking questions, also please feel free to address them right now, or to ask them right now.
Yeah, I actually have a question, and my name is Hanyang, and then I'm also living in Cambridge, in Massachusetts. So it was very interesting. It was really very interesting for me, much more. And then I'm glad to meet you. And then especially I was very interested in the salt desert, which is very open and welcoming place, and then also makes some great harmony with the surrounding environments. It was really amazing. But then I'm wondering that, was there any kind of the issue with the city government related to the hygiene issue? Because in Korea, the kind of issue came up like 10 years ago, and then all the playground, all the paving on the playground, which the children's playing around, is just changed to the cork from the sand. So we are not use any kind of natural ingredient in there. So I'm just curious about that point.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just wondering, like, is the question about the hygiene of the salt washing onto the playgrounds or something like that?
Not really. So for example, the sand was used to use as a pave in the playground for children, but then it brought the kind of the issue, like kind of the poop from the rats, and then the other kind of the mold, or kind of the kind of issue came out. So the city just restricts to use that kind of ingredient. So I just wondered that.
Yeah, we've definitely encountered that issue with playgrounds, and also the fact that like when you use sand, it can conceal things like syringes, unfortunately, and things like that. So it's something that Boston at least is not using as much as they used to. And then with the salt, we've only used the salt as a kind of interactive material for very discrete and kind of limited events and installations. So, for theater performances that are really only accessed by the actors and stagehands, and then for the Lumen Film Festival, that's a one night, several hour event. So it's not something where people are spending a whole lot of time with the salt. Salt is, obviously like sand, it's a safe material, it's inert, but as you point out, there are, if you spend a lot of time on it, it'll dry out your skin, it will, your shoes will get kind of caked up with it. It's not something that you would use for a kind of long-term contact, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was wondering specifically, which I had mentioned to my students in another class, how Boston has these sliver parcels that are undevelopable because of zoning regulations. But then if you look at other higher density places, like Seoul or perhaps in New York, it happens as well, that even if it's like a meter width parcel, they'll find a way of using it. Yeah. Have you guys looked into stuff like that is neither infrastructural or industrial in terms of you know, these big scales, but perhaps small scale voids that could offer something to activating different communities or neighborhoods?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We haven't we haven't done projects like that. I'm a fan of you know, a lot of the work I've seen other designers do with little micro architecture interventions in types of spaces like that, and makes me think of, you know, Atelier Bow Wow for sure, and sort of thing. But ourselves, we haven't had the opportunity to work on really small sites. We've worked on a lot of really big ones, but I think that same kind of you still need that same attention to detail. At any big site actually still has a lot of those scales of things happening, and for us that has often like paying attention to that scale has often kind of created opportunities to do things that are different, and kind of question the homogeneity of the development approaches that more typically would be taken with those areas.
Yeah, actually, I'm quite impressed with, I really love the drawings that you guys have in detailing these very small scale, yeah, details of a extra large project.
Yeah.
Even in how to fold the tarp, you know, for that other installation, it's which is a minor detail, but then it's of
It's the whole
huge,
project.
yeah, it's the whole thing,
Yeah.
right? So you might think it's out, but you just fold it.
Yeah,
But,
no, and if you unfold it the wrong way, you kind
yeah,
of can't fold it back up. So
it's really amazing to see the detail of all these drawings that go, you know, to that very sense of understanding what will a small scale implication could have ripple effects at the larger scale for the overall project. So
yeah.
Perhaps any last question, because I know you have to go put your kid to bed.
Thanks. Yeah.
So if there's any last question, we'll take that one, or if not, we'll end up wrapping up. Anybody have any last comment or question? Okay. Well, if not, then thank you again for giving us this great lecture. It's going to be accessible on YouTube for anybody else. So I'll share the link. Really appreciate your time. I know it's late for you, so thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It was really great to share the work with everybody.
Awesome. Well, thank you, and hope we get to talk and see more of your project.
I hope so too. It was great to reconnect with you, Raphael.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.